I remember the exact moment everything in my life shifted. The oxygen machine in Mr. Whitaker's room went silent, and with it, the brittle rhythm of a man's final breaths came to an end. I placed the morphine dispenser gently on the table, thinking my role as caregiver had finally finished. But then, his lawyer turned to me, eyes steady, voice carrying more weight than I could bear. He asked for my full legal name. For a second, I felt the air leave my lungs. My palms turned damp, and I could hear nothing but the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of that wood-paneled study. Around me, silence stretched heavy, as if the walls themselves knew something I didn't. It wasn't just a legal formality. I could feel it in the way everyone's gaze shifted toward me. Something about that question was tied to more than paperwork. It carried history, secrets, maybe even betrayal. My chest tightened as I realized this wasn't about closing a chapter. It was about opening one I didn't know existed. That portrait above the fireplace, an unfamiliar young woman with dark eyes and a quiet smile seemed to be watching me. A delicate locket on the desk gleamed under the lamp, its initials engraved in gold. I had seen it before, but never paid attention. In that moment, it felt like a key waiting to unlock everything I thought I knew about myself. I wanted to protest, to ask why my name mattered so much now, but my voice refused to rise. All I could do was sit there, caught between fear and curiosity, knowing the truth was seconds away from breaking through the silence. Before I can explain how I ended up in that surreal moment, I need to take you back just 72 hours earlier when I walked through the gates of the Whitaker estate, still believing I was only there to do a job. At that point in my life, I was 62 and worn thin. My husband had passed, and the savings we once clung to had been swallowed whole by his medical bills. I used to think grief was the hardest thing to carry. But the truth is, survival can feel heavier. I was desperate for work, any work that would keep me afloat and give me a reason to get up each morning. When I answered the ad for a live-in caregiver, I told myself it was just another job, nothing more. I didn't expect to be driving up through the Hudson Valley, past those iron gates, into a world that seemed built to remind people like me where we didn't belong. The Whitaker estate stretched across acres of manicured land, stone walls rising like a fortress, and windows staring down with a kind of cold judgment. Stepping into that house, I felt my shoulders tense. Everything was polished, expensive, intimidating. I reminded myself to breathe, to remember that I wasn't there for the art on the walls or the grand staircase. I was there to do what I'd always done, care for someone who needed help. When I first met Lawrence Whitaker, I noticed the sharpness in his gaze. His body was failing, but his eyes told a different story. They studied me, measured me, almost as if I were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. I adjusted his pillows and tried to offer the same calm I'd given countless patients before him. I didn't know it then, but that moment was the beginning of something far more complicated than caregiving. Rosa Alvarez, the longtime housekeeper, gave me a look I couldn't forget. It was the kind of look that said, "Brace yourself." Later, I would learn she'd seen a dozen caregivers come and go in just 2 years. But in that moment, I told myself not to take anything personally. I thought I was tougher than that. What unsettled me most were the questions Lawrence asked in those early days. They weren't the polite questions of a man making small talk. They were personal, about my childhood, where I grew up, even the hospital where I was born. At first, I thought it was simply the rambling curiosity of a lonely old man. But there was something in his tone, something intentional, that left me unsettled. I brushed it aside, convincing myself that I was overthinking. But looking back now, I realized those questions weren't random at all. They were breadcrumbs, and I was already following a path I didn't know I was on. And that path led straight into the moment where everything I thought I knew about myself was about to collapse. I didn't have to wait long for the first crack in the world I thought I knew. When the lawyer read aloud that Mr. Whitaker had left his entire fortune to a lost daughter, my stomach sank. I remember staring at the polished wood of the table, telling myself this had nothing to do with me. But then, as if the air itself shifted, his gaze fixed directly on me. He asked for my full legal name. It wasn't just curiosity. It was deliberate, like he already knew what I would say. My pulse quickened. My hands trembled against my lap, and I felt an ache of dread crawl through me. In that moment, the entire room seemed to blur. I could sense something waiting just beyond reach, something that had been circling me for months without my realizing it. I wanted to brush it off, to convince myself it was coincidence, but deep down, I knew. Whatever truth they were circling around was about me. I told myself to stay calm, but inside, I was bracing for impact, like a wave was about to crash over me and change everything. And I was right. The moment that question about my full legal name was asked, my mind went racing back over the past 6 months. Suddenly, all of those strange conversations with Lawrence began to rearrange themselves like puzzle pieces snapping into place. He hadn't been making small talk. He had been digging. I remembered how he'd asked about my birthday, about the town where I grew up, even the hospital where I had been born. At the time, I brushed it off as curiosity. But who asks a caregiver about the exact ward of their birth? It hadn't felt right then, and now it terrified me. For decades, I had carried my story like a wound I refused to reopen. My adoptive parents passed when I was 30, and with them went the only version of my beginnings I thought I had. I learned to avoid questions, to skip over dates on forms, to silence the little voice that asked who I really was. To most people, I was just Helen Moore wife, mother, and later, a widow trying to make ends meet, and that was safer. Safer than remembering the uncertainty of being given away. But now, in that study, I realized Lawrence had been watching me carefully from the very first day. The way his eyes lingered on my face, the long silences after my answers, he had been searching for something. And that thought sent a cold shiver through me. It's strange how you can sense when your life is about to be rewritten. My instincts told me that the foundation I had built for 62 years was about to crack open. I tried to steady my breath, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I wanted to believe this was nothing more than a misunderstanding. Yet, in my gut, I knew better. Whatever secrets he had uncovered, they weren't about some stranger. They were about me. And soon enough, I would see the proof laid bare in front of me. The lawyer's hands opened a folder, and suddenly my life wasn't mine anymore. Birth records, adoption papers, hospital notes, details I had spent decades burying were now staring back at me in black ink. My name, my date of birth, my origin, all connected to someone I had never allowed myself to imagine. Then came the photograph. A young couple, frozen in time. The boyish face of Lawrence Whitaker at 18, standing beside a girl whose eyes mirrored mine. Her belly round with pregnancy, her expression caught between fear and love. They said her name was Emily Carter. In that instant, it was like looking into a mirror of a life I might have lived. I didn't know whether to believe it until the lawyer placed a small velvet box in my hands. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was a gold locket, its surface engraved with the initials E.C. On one side, a faded picture of Emily smiling softly, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. On the other, a tiny photograph of a newborn swaddled in hospital blankets. That baby was me, and then the letter, handwritten, delicate, carrying the weight of 60 years. Lawrence had confessed he had me investigated from the very first day I walked into his house. He admitted he was too much of a coward to speak the truth face to face, but he wanted me to know I was his daughter. He wrote of searching for me every day since Emily died, of the love he carried for a child he never got to raise. Reading those words, I felt my chest tighten. The word daughter stared back at me, and for the first time in my life, I realized someone had claimed me as their own. I wanted to reject it, to cling to the story I'd always known, but my shaking hands betrayed me. Deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning of a truth I wasn't prepared for. As I held that letter, the truth settled over me like a weight I couldn't escape. I wasn't just Lawrence Whitaker's caregiver. I was his daughter, his only heir. Every question, every long stare, every small kindness suddenly made sense. He hadn't been hiring help, he had been trying to bring his child home. And yet, my first reaction wasn't joy. It wasn't even relief. It was disbelief. I thought of my adoptive parents, Paul and Ellen, the ones who had given me love and stability. Had they known? Had they carried this secret, protecting me from a truth I was never meant to uncover? Then came the mention of inheritance, the estate, the businesses, the millions, numbers that meant nothing to someone who had been counting every dollar for groceries just days earlier. My whole life, I had fought to survive. Now, I was being told I had more wealth than I could comprehend. But what struck me hardest wasn't the money. It was the word I had ached to hear my entire life, daughter. For the first time, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't the girl given away. I was wanted. I tried to push the thought aside, to tell myself it was impossible. But deep down, something inside me softened, recognizing a truth I had run from for too long. Still, I couldn't ignore the nagging fear that nothing in this house came without a cost. If Lawrence had chosen to reveal this in such a carefully orchestrated way, what else was waiting to surface? I remember when the lawyer finally named the figure. Around $47,000 in financial assets, and with the estate, the art, and the businesses, the total came to about 63,000 learn. The number almost didn't feel real. Just that morning, I had been worried about rent and bus fare. By nightfall, I was being told I had more money than I could ever spend. But the number didn't sit with me the way it should have. I didn't feel like I had just won the lottery. Instead, I thought about the dinners Lawrence had insisted I share with him, the evenings when he pressed me to read stories aloud. He wasn't testing my patience. He had been trying to know me as his daughter, not just as an employee. As I stood in the hallway later, my eyes fell on the portrait of Emily Carter, my birth mother. For years, I had wondered what she looked like, if I carried her features. And now, here she was, gazing down at me through brushstrokes that had outlived her. My throat tightened, and I whispered a word I had never spoken aloud before, Mom. It felt both foreign and familiar, like opening a door I didn't realize had always been locked. The money was overwhelming, yes, but what mattered most in that moment was belonging. For the first time, I felt rooted. For the first time, I wasn't drifting. Still, a quiet unease lingered. If this truth had been hidden so carefully, what else might be waiting in the shadows of this house the next morning? The house no longer felt like mine alone. When I walked into the living room, I found 3 strangers waiting. Caroline Whitaker Sloan, sharp in her tailored suit, sat with her brothers Grant and Philip. Their faces carried the same Whitaker bloodline, but none of the warmth. The tension was immediate. They didn't need to speak for me to understand why they were there. Entitlement hung on them like expensive perfume. They had grown up expecting this estate, this fortune, this legacy, and now I was the disruption. I listened as they made their case, cloaked in polite words about family loyalty and tradition. But underneath was something much harsher. They saw me as an intruder, a woman who had no right to walk through these halls, much less inherit them. It didn't matter that I had spent months caring for Lawrence when they hadn't. To them, bloodlines only counted when it served their claim. My heart raced, but I steadied myself by looking at Emily's portrait on the wall. Her painted eyes reminded me that I belonged here, whether they liked it or not. I wanted to tell them I never asked for any of this, that I hadn't even known the truth until days ago. But I could see it wouldn't have mattered. They weren't listening for truth. They were listening for weakness. I kept my composure, though inside I was bracing for another storm. Because if there was one thing I had learned in life, it was that when people show up uninvited, they usually want something you aren't ready to give. And with Caroline's piercing stare fixed on me, I knew this battle was only beginning. I thought their hostility was born out of shock, but soon I learned it was something far darker. Rosa Alvarez, who had always carried herself with quiet loyalty, came to me one evening, her voice shaking as she finally unburdened herself. She told me Caroline had known the truth about me months before anyone else. Caroline had run her own background check when I first arrived. She discovered I was Lawrence's biological daughter, but instead of embracing it, she turned it into a weapon. Rosa explained how Caroline had threatened Lawrence, using his medical records as leverage. She warned him that if he revealed who I really was, she would push to have him declared mentally incompetent. The pieces fell into place with a sickening clarity. The restrictions on his pain medication, the unnecessary treatments, the way he seemed trapped in his own house, it hadn't just been illness. Caroline had been tightening her grip, keeping him dependent, keeping him silent. Hearing that truth left me furious, but beneath the anger was grief. Lawrence had spent his last months caught between the joy of finding me and the fear of losing everything to her threats. He had wanted to tell me. He just couldn't. That realization lit a fire inside me. If Caroline thought she could erase me the way she tried to erase his voice, she was wrong. I wasn't going to let her bury the truth. Not about him, and not about me. After Rosa's confession, I knew I couldn't stand by and hope the truth would surface on its own. I had to dig, even if what I uncovered broke me further. With the keys Daniel Price had given me, I unlocked Lawrence's old desk. Inside, I found a lifetime of unanswered letters, dozens written to adoption agencies and private investigators. Year after year, he had begged for help to find his daughter. Some were formal, some were desperate, and as the years passed, the handwriting grew shakier. He had never stopped searching for me. But it wasn't just letters. Tucked between stacks of paper were financial records, transfers from Lawrence's accounts that made no sense. Notes in the margins carried Caroline's handwriting, cold reminders to restrict medication, to approve unnecessary treatments, to justify her control over him. And then I found the letter he had hidden, written just weeks before his death. In it, Lawrence admitted that Caroline had manipulated him, that she had exceeded her limited power of attorney, that she had stolen from him while keeping me at a distance. He confessed his fear of her threats, but he also confessed his fear of losing me if I learned the truth too late. At the bottom of the page, he signed it not with his usual flourish, but with a single word that cut through me, Dad. I sat there for a long time, the word echoing in my chest. I had waited my whole life to be called someone's daughter, and now, too late. I had the proof that he had wanted me all along. I gathered everything: Rosa's testimony, the bank records, the medical notes, the DNA results, and his letters. Piece by piece, I was building a wall of evidence strong enough to withstand their attacks. It wasn't just about protecting an inheritance anymore. It was about protecting his name, his dignity, and the truth of who we were to each other. The newspapers painted me as a schemer, a caregiver who had preyed on a vulnerable man. Every headline hurt, but when I closed the drawer and locked away the documents, I knew I had something stronger than rumor. I had the truth, and soon I would take it into the light. The day of the hearing arrived faster than I was ready for. The courthouse was packed, the weight of every stare pressing down on me as I walked in. Reporters whispered, cameras clicked, and I could feel the judgment before a word was spoken. To them, I was already guilty, just another caregiver accused of taking advantage of someone too frail to fight back. Inside the courtroom, Caroline's lawyers came out swinging. They painted me as a manipulative woman who had wormed her way into Lawrence's life, who had convinced him to change his will when he was at his weakest. They questioned the timing of the DNA tests, hinted at fraud, and painted Caroline and her brothers as the dutiful relatives who had been there all along. I sat still, letting their words wash over me. My palms rested on my lap, and I stared at my hands that had bathed the sick, lifted the dying, and worked jobs that broke my back just to keep a roof over my head. Hands that had never once schemed to steal. It would have been easy to let fear take over, to shrink into the story they wanted me to fit. But I remembered Lawrence's last letter, his plea for me not to let them steal what belonged to me, not just in money, but in truth. That thought steadied me. When Daniel Price rose to speak, I felt a shift. His voice was calm, deliberate, not desperate to win the crowd, but anchored in evidence. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something like hope. Just when the courtroom tension seemed unbearable, the evidence I had gathered began to change everything. The hidden letters, the financial records, the medical notes, all pieces Lawrence had carefully preserved, shifted the narrative completely. What had started as a fight over inheritance became a revelation of abuse, manipulation, and deceit. I watched as Caroline's confidence wavered, her face draining of color when the documents laid bare her control over Lawrence's life and finances. The proof of her threats, her interference with his care, and the unauthorized transfers was undeniable. Every piece of paper, every marginal note told a story of someone trying to erase both him and me from the truth. In that moment, I realized that this fight wasn't about money anymore. It was about justice for Lawrence, for me, for the life he had tried so hard to protect. The fear I had felt for weeks began to give way to a steady determination. I wasn't just a woman claiming a fortune. I was a daughter honoring the man who had spent decades searching for me, the man who had hidden these truths to keep us safe. The courtroom held its breath, and I could feel a quiet shift. The evidence didn't just support my claim, it exposed the harm Lawrence endured, the manipulation I had narrowly avoided, and the lengths someone had gone to keep us apart. And for the first time, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Not the weight of inheritance, but the weight of truth finally being recognized. The day the verdict came, I felt an unfamiliar calm settle over me. The courtroom had been tense for hours, the weight of every stare pressing in from all sides. Caroline and her brothers sat rigid, confident in the power of their name, unaware that every piece of evidence Lawrence had hidden would soon unravel their claims. When the judge acknowledged the DNA evidence, the letters, and the financial records, a quiet sense of justice washed over me. The court didn't just confirm my inheritance, it recognized the elder abuse, the manipulation, and the deceit that Caroline had carried out for years. It was validation not just of my claim, but of Lawrence's struggle and the truth he had protected all this time. I remember sitting there, letting the words sink in. Relief, grief, and gratitude mingled in a way that left me speechless. I wasn't just Helen Moore anymore. I was his daughter, the woman he had searched for, the woman he had trusted to carry his legacy. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed and voices shouted questions I wasn't ready to answer. Yet, I felt anchored. My first thought wasn't about the fortune, the estate, or the businesses. It was about honoring Lawrence's memory and ensuring the truth of our story was preserved. For the first time, I felt the burden of years lift. Not because I had inherited wealth, but because the man who had loved me as his daughter, even from a distance, had finally been vindicated. 6 months later, the house felt alive in a way it never had before. The Whitaker estate, once a place of quiet tension and secrets, had become a home anchored in memory and purpose. I had established the Emily Carter Foundation, dedicated to reuniting adopted children with their birth families safely and ethically. Lawrence's vision, carried through me, was now taking shape in the world. Walking through the hallways, I could see traces of the life he had tried to protect. Portraits, letters, and small tokens of his search were now preserved, not hidden. I often paused at Emily's portrait, thinking of the mother I had never known, imagining the pride she might feel seeing the daughter she had given up living fully, finally connected to her origins. The estate became more than a home. It became a sanctuary, retreats for adoption support groups, spaces for families to heal and connect. It wasn't just my inheritance. It was a legacy of love, determination, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Each evening, I sat in Lawrence's study, reading letters he had written to me over the years but never sent. They were filled with hope, love, and the quiet dreams of a man who never gave up, though I never got to call him Dad while he was alive. Every word reminded me of his presence, guiding me, proud of the woman I had become. And in those moments, I realized that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones you never knew were missing until you finally find them. Sitting in Lawrence's study now, I often reflect on how fragile and unpredictable life can be. Money, titles, and estates can change in an instant. But what truly matters is the love we give, the truth we honor, and the connections we protect. I have inherited more than wealth. I have inherited a story of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of family. I want anyone listening to remember this. Sometimes the life you were given isn't the one you expected, but it can still lead you exactly where you are meant to be. You may carry secrets, regrets, or questions for years, but the chance to find closure, to make things right, can come when you least expect it. If Lawrence's story teaches me anything, it's that love doesn't end with distance, absence, or time. It can find a way across decades, across silence, across the walls that separate us. And even if you feel alone, there's always hope that someone, somewhere, has been looking for you, just as you have been searching for them. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like, share, or leave a comment. Tell someone you care about them, or share a story of your own. Life is too short not to connect, too precious not to honor the people who shaped us, and too fleeting to leave love unspoken.